Welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving deep into one of the most provocative, mind-altering books ever written about uncertainty, chaos, and the hidden advantage of thriving in disorder. The book is called Antifragile, and it was written by Nassim Taleb, a Lebanese-American mathematician, statistician, and former options trader who has spent his entire career studying the mathematics of randomness and the real-world consequences of unpredictable events. This is not just another self-help book that tells you to be more resilient. This is a complete reimagining of how we should think about risk, stress, volatility, and the fundamental nature of systems, from your own body to entire economies. And by the end of this video, you will never look at stress, chaos, or uncertainty the same way again. Let me start with a simple story that Taleb uses throughout his work to illustrate the core idea. Imagine you have two objects. Point one is a glass cup, the other is a 9-pound hammer. If you drop the glass cup, it shatters. If you drop the hammer, nothing happens. The glass is fragile. It breaks under stress. But now imagine a third object, a muscle. If you lift a heavy weight, your muscle fibers tear slightly. Then they repair themselves thicker and stronger than before. The muscle does not merely survive stressed, it requires stress to grow. It becomes better because of the pressure. Taleb calls this antifragility. It is not resilience. Resilience is about withstanding shock and staying the same. Antifragility is about getting better because of shock. It is the difference between a phoenix and a rock. A rock endures. The phoenix is reborn stronger from its own ashes. Before we go deeper, let me tell you something about the man behind this book. Nassim Taleb was born in Lebanon in 1960. He grew up during the Lebanese Civil War, which lasted from 1975 to 1990. He witnessed firsthand how fragile systems collapse under extreme stress. He saw governments fall, economies implode, and societies reorganize themselves in ways no one predicted. After the war, he moved to the United States, earned a master's degree in finance from MIT, and then a PhD in management science from the same institution. He worked as an options trader on Wall Street, where he saw the devastating consequences of financial models that assumed calm, predictable markets. In 2008, he predicted the global financial crisis long before it happened, while most economists and bankers were blind to the risks building beneath the surface. Antifragile, published in 2014, is the third book in his Incerto series, following The Black Swan and Fooled by Randomness. Together, these books form a complete philosophy about uncertainty, probability, and how to live wisely in an unpredictable world. Now, what is the core thesis of Antifragile? Taleb argues that the opposite of fragility is not resilience. Most people think it is. They believe that if something is not fragile, it must be strong or tough. But Taleb says that is a false dichotomy. There is a third category. Antifragile systems actually benefit from volatility, randomness, and stressors. They need disorder to thrive. Think about it. Your immune system gets stronger when exposed to pathogens. Your bones get denser when you put weight on them. Your skills improve when you practice under pressure. Even economies become more innovative when they face competition and crises. The problem is that modern society has become obsessed with eliminating stress, volatility, and uncertainty. We build systems that are so optimized, so smoothed over, so protected that they become hyperfragile. We remove small failures from our lives, and in doing so, we create the conditions for catastrophic ones. Taleb introduces a concept he calls the ludic fallacy, which is the mistake of treating real-world uncertainty as if it were the clean, well-defined randomness you find in games and textbooks. In a casino, the probabilities are known. In life, they are not. When we try to manage the real world using simplified models, we create blind spots. We ignore the unknown unknowns, the events that no model can predict because they have never happened before. The 2008 financial crisis was a textbook example. Bankers used mathematical models that assumed housing prices would not fall nationwide. Those models had never seen such a scenario. They were fragile in the face of the very event they failed to anticipate. Taleb spent years warning about this. He called it the black swan problem. Antifragile is his answer to that problem. It is not about predicting the unpredictable. It is about building systems, both personal and societal, that can withstand and even benefit from the unpredictable. Let me give you another example that makes this concrete. Consider the modern food industry. We have engineered our food to be shelf-stable, uniform, and predictable. We have removed the natural variations that once kept our bodies adaptive. Processed foods have long expiration dates because they contain preservatives and additives that kill the very microbes and enzymes that would trigger our immune responses. We live in overly sanitized environments. We use antibacterial soaps. We pasteurize everything. The result is not a healthier population. It is a population with weakened immune systems, rising rates of autoimmune diseases, and increasing allergies. Our bodies have lost their antifragile capacity because we have removed the small stressors that once trained them to respond. Taleb would argue that we should embrace some controlled stress. Eat food that can spoil. Expose yourself to a wider variety of microbes. Let your body do what it evolved to do. The same logic applies to our economic and political systems. We have built a world where governments bail out failing institutions, where central banks inject trillions of dollars into markets to prevent corrections, and where we treat every recession as an abnormality to be eliminated rather than a natural cycle that cleanses the system. Taleb calls this the medication disease. When you treat symptoms without addressing the underlying cause, you create a dependency that makes the system weaker over time. The patient becomes more fragile with each dose. In 2008, the bailout of banks was supposed to stabilize the system, but what it did was create moral hazard. Banks learned that they could take enormous risks knowing that if things went wrong, the government would catch them. This is the opposite of anti-fragility. This is fragility disguised as stability. The system became more dangerous because we tried to make it safer. One of the most powerful ideas in the book is what Taleb calls the hypothesis of mild stressors. He argues that exposure to manageable stress is essential for growth and adaptation. This is true at every level. Biologically, your body needs the stress of exercise to build muscle and strengthen bones. Psychologically, you need the stress of challenges and failures to build character and emotional resilience. Socially, communities need the stress of competition and conflict to develop stronger institutions and more innovative solutions. Taleb uses the example of the Japanese archipelago. Japan is one of the most seismically active places on Earth. Earthquakes are constant, but rather than building massive earthquake-resistant structures that create a false sense of security, traditional Japanese architecture embraced flexibility. Wooden structures swayed with the tremors. They absorbed the energy. They survived. Modern engineering, by contrast, tries to resist the earthquake with rigid, heavy constructions. When the earthquake comes, those rigid structures are the ones that fail catastrophically. The flexible ones endure. This is the principle of anti-fragility in architecture. Taleb also explores the concept of optionality, which is a practical tool for living an anti-fragile life. Optionality means keeping your options open. IT means positioning yourself so that you benefit from uncertainty rather than being harmed by it. In finance, an option gives you the right but not the obligation to buy or sell something at a certain price. You pay a small premium for that right. And if the market moves in your favor, you gain enormously. If it moves against you, you only lose the premium. Taleb argues that we should apply this logic to our lives. Instead of making rigid, long-term plans, we should create portfolios of small bets. We should keep our careers flexible. We should maintain diverse skills. We should avoid debt and dependency. Each small bet is an option. Most will fail, but a few will pay off massively, and the asymmetric payoff structure means that the wins far outweigh the losses. This is how you turn uncertainty from a threat into an opportunity. Let me talk about the chapters of Antifragile. Because this book is structured in a way that builds your understanding progressively, the book is divided into 5 parts. The first part is called the nonlinears. This section introduces the fundamental problem with linear thinking. Most people think that cause and effect are proportional. A little stress causes a little harm. More stress causes more harm. But Taleb shows that in the real world, small causes can have enormous effects, and large causes can have surprisingly small effects. The butterfly effect is a metaphor for this. A single butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil can cause a tornado in Texas. This is because complex systems are highly sensitive to initial conditions. Taleb uses the example of the 1987 stock market crash, known as Black Monday. On October 19, 1987, the Dow Jones dropped nearly 22% in a single day. No one predicted it. No model anticipated it. It was a black swan event, a rare and unpredictable shock that had devastating consequences precisely because no one was prepared for it. The lesson is that the world is not linear. Small uncertainties can accumulate and then explode into massive disruptions. The second part is called the antifragile. Here Taleb defines the concept more precisely and gives you the tools to recognize it in the world around you. He distinguishes between fragility, resilience, and antifragility using a taxonomy that is surprisingly elegant. Fragile things break under stress. Resilient things resist stress and stay the same. Antifragile things grow under stress. He then applies this to a wide range of domains. He talks about how the human body is antifragile, how culture is antifragile, how markets are antifragile when left alone, but fragile when overregulated. He introduces the idea of the barbell strategy, which is a way of managing risk that involves avoiding the middle ground. Instead of investing in moderate risk assets that seem safe but are actually vulnerable to unexpected shocks, you invest in extremely safe assets and extremely risky assets. You avoid the medium risk zone where you think you are safe but are actually exposed to hidden dangers. Taleb uses the example of a portfolio that is 90% in cash and 10% in highly speculative investments. The cash protects you from disaster. The speculative investments give you upside exposure to black swan events. You are anti-fragile because you benefit from volatility while being protected from ruin. The third part is called From Yoga to the Ancient. This is where Taleb connects the ancient wisdom traditions to modern anti-fragile thinking. He argues that the pre-modern world understood anti-fragility intuitively. They did not have the vocabulary for it, but they lived it. Fasting was a way to stress the body and make it stronger. Physical labor was a way to build resilience. Communities were small and local, which made them adaptable. Religion provided rituals that helped people cope with uncertainty and suffering. Taleb is particularly fascinated by Stoicism, the ancient Greek philosophy that taught people to embrace hardship and view adversity as an opportunity for growth. He also discusses the practice of yoga, which deliberately introduces physical stress to the body to build strength and flexibility. He contrasts this with the modern tendency to seek comfort and avoid all forms of discomfort. We have created a world where people are terrified of minor inconveniences. A delayed flight is a catastrophe. A slightly uncomfortable meal is a reason to complain. Taleb calls this the fragility of the modern sensibility. When you eliminate all small stresses from your life, you become psychologically fragile. You lose the ability to handle real adversity. The fourth part is called the methodology. This is the most practical section of the book, where Taleb gives you concrete tools for living an anti-fragile life. He discusses the importance of trial and error. He argues that we learn through mistakes, not through careful planning. The scientific method itself is anti-fragile. You hypothesize, you test, you fail, you refine. Each failure makes your understanding stronger. Taleb applies this to decision-making. He says you should prefer methods that allow for frequent small failures over methods that promise smooth success but hide catastrophic risks. He uses the example of the European Union. The EU was designed to be a stable, predictable institution, but by trying to control every aspect of economic policy, it created a system that is incredibly fragile. When a crisis hits, there is no room for adjustment. Everything is locked in place. Taleb would argue that a more anti-fragile approach would allow individual member states to fail, to experiment, to learn from their mistakes. The system as a whole would be stronger because it could adapt. The fifth and final part is called fragility and its kind. Here Taleb expands his analysis to broader societal and cultural issues. He discusses the role of media in creating fragility. He argues that the modern media ecosystem rewards sensationalism and punishes nuance. Headlines are designed to shock you. Complex issues are reduced to simple narratives. This creates a population that is emotionally fragile, easily upset by minor events, and incapable of handling complexity. He also discusses the role of academia in promoting fragility. He argues that universities reward conformity and punish innovation. Professors are incentivized to publish in safe, incremental ways rather than take bold risks. The result is a body of knowledge that is elegant but disconnected from reality. Taleb calls this the intellectual yet, referring to people who have studied a subject extensively but have no practical understanding of it. They know the theory but not the practice. They are fragile because they cannot handle situations that fall outside their theoretical framework. Now let me talk about the reception of this book. Antifragile was widely praised by critics and readers alike. The New York Times called it a manifesto for living in an uncertain world. The Wall Street Journal said it would change the way you think about risk. Many readers have described it as a life-changing book. They say it helped them understand why their careers, their relationships, and their health were failing despite their best efforts to control everything. One reader wrote that after reading Antifragile, he started practicing intermittent fasting, taking cold showers, and seeking out challenging experiences instead of avoiding them. He said his energy levels, his mental clarity, and his overall well-being improved dramatically. Another reader said the book helped her understand why her carefully planned career path kept falling apart, and why the detours and failures were actually making her stronger in the long run. She started embracing uncertainty instead of fighting it. Critics have also pointed out some limitations. Some argue that Taleb's writing style can be dense and repetitive. He tends to circle around the same ideas using different examples, which can be frustrating for readers who want a more streamlined presentation. Others have criticized his dismissal of academic economics and finance, arguing that he oversimplifies the work of researchers he disagrees with. There have been debates about whether his barbell strategy is practical for everyone. Some people simply cannot afford to keep 90% of their assets in cash. They need to invest in moderate risk options to build wealth. Taleb acknowledges this but maintains that the principle of avoiding the middle ground applies at every level, not just in finance. Let me go deeper into one of the most important chapters in the book. Chapter 14 is called The Dog and the Tail. This is a brilliant metaphor that Taleb uses to explain the asymmetry of risk. Imagine a dog wagging its tail. The tail wags the dog. The small part controls the large part. But now imagine the reverse. A tail that is tied to a dog. The dog wags the tail. The large part controls the small part. In most systems, the tail wags the dog. Small, seemingly insignificant factors can have enormous consequences. A single tweet can crash a stock. A minor bug in software can cause a global outage. A small misunderstanding between two people can escalate into a war. Taleb uses this metaphor to explain why we should pay more attention to the tail than to the dog. We should focus on the small, uncertain, hard-to-measure factors rather than the large, obvious, measurable ones. The large factors are easy to see. The small factors are easy to ignore, but the small factors are the ones that matter most. Another crucial concept is the tripwire. Taleb argues that we need early warning systems that trigger action before a small problem becomes a catastrophic one. The tripwire is a simple rule that says if condition X is met, you take action Y immediately. No deliberation. No analysis paralysis, just action. He gives the example of a fire alarm. When the alarm goes off, you do not hold a committee meeting to discuss whether there is actually a fire. You evacuate. The tripwire is the alarm. It forces action before the situation deteriorates beyond repair. Taleb argues that we should build tripwires into our personal lives, our businesses, and our governments. In investing, a tripwire might be a rule that says if your portfolio drops 10%, you sell half of it immediately. In health, a tripwire might be a rule that says if your blood pressure reaches a certain level, you change your diet and exercise immediately. In relationships, a tripwire might be a rule that says if you have the same argument 3 times in a week, you seek counseling immediately. The point is to create automatic responses that prevent small problems from becoming large ones. Taleb also introduces the concept of the error bar, which is a way of acknowledging uncertainty in your estimates and predictions. Most people present their forecasts as if they were certain. They say the economy will grow by 2%. They say a company will earn $5 per share. They present a single number as if it were the truth. Taleb says this is intellectually dishonest. The truth is that you do not know The only honest response is to give a range, an error bar, that reflects your uncertainty. He argues that when you present error bars, you are more likely to be right because you are not claiming precision that you do not have, you are acknowledging the limits of your knowledge. This is a small but powerful shift in thinking. It changes how you make decisions. Instead of optimizing for a single outcome, you optimize for a range of outcomes. You prepare for multiple scenarios. You become anti-fragile because you are not blindsided by events outside your narrow prediction. Let me now explore the relationship between Antifragile and Taleb's earlier work, particularly The Black Swan. The Black Swan was published in 2008, just before the financial crisis. It described the phenomenon of rare, unpredictable events that have enormous consequences. Taleb argued that these events are impossible to predict but extremely important to prepare for. He gave examples from history: the rise of the internet, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the attack on Pearl Harbor. Each of these events was unpredictable in hindsight but had massive consequences. The Black Swan is about the epistemological problem of knowing too little. Antifragile is about the practical problem of living well despite that ignorance. It is the answer to the question that the Black Swan raises: if we cannot predict the unpredictable, how should we live? The answer is to build antifragile systems that benefit from uncertainty rather than being destroyed by it. One of the most striking passages in Antifragile is Taleb's discussion of the concept of time. He argues that modern society has a distorted relationship with time. We are obsessed with the future. We plan 10 years ahead. We make projections for next quarter. We try to control outcomes that are years away. But Taleb says this is the wrong approach. The future is unknowable. The only thing you can control is the present moment. He advocates for a philosophy he calls presentism. Focus on what you can do right now. Make small, correct decisions in the present. Do not worry about the long term because you cannot predict it. This is not a call for recklessness. It is a call for humility. It is an acknowledgement that you do not know what the future holds, and the best you can do is position yourself to benefit from whatever comes. Taleb also has strong opinions about medicine and healthcare. He argues that modern medicine is dangerously fragile. Doctors prescribe medications for every minor symptom. They treat the body as a machine that needs constant maintenance, but this approach creates a population that is dependent on pharmaceuticals and vulnerable to side effects. Taleb advocates for a more natural approach. He supports practices like fasting, cold exposure, and intermittent exercise. He argues that the body has incredible healing abilities if you give it the chance to use them. He is particularly critical of the overuse of antibiotics, which he says is creating a generation of people with weakened immune systems and drug-resistant bacteria. He believes that many modern diseases are iatrogenic, meaning they are caused by medical interventions. This is a controversial claim, but Taleb supports it with data and reasoning. He argues that the medical establishment is too focused on treating symptoms rather than addressing root causes. Let me discuss the concept of the skin in the game, which Taleb introduces in this book and expands in his later work. The idea is simple: you should not make decisions about something unless you have personal risk involved. If you are advising someone on their investments, you should have your own money at stake. If you are a government official making policy, you should be personally affected by the consequences. Taleb argues that modern society is full of people who make decisions without skin in the game. Bankers who take enormous risks with other people's money, politicians who make war but do not fight in it, experts who write books about how to live but do not practice what they preach. This is a major source of fragility. When decision makers do not bear the consequences of their decisions, they have no incentive to be careful. They take excessive risks because they do not suffer the losses. Anti-fragile systems require skin in the game because they align incentives with outcomes. Another important theme is the role of suffering in human development. Taleb argues that suffering is not something to be eliminated. It is something to be embraced. He believes that a life without suffering is a life without meaning. He draws on the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote that what does not kill you makes you stronger. Taleb extends this idea to entire civilizations. He argues that societies that have never experienced hardship are weak and decadent. They lack the resilience to handle real crises. He points to the decline of the Roman Empire as an example. Rome became so comfortable and secure that it lost the martial virtues that had made it powerful. When barbarian armies invaded, Rome was too fragile to resist. Taleb is not advocating for war or poverty. He is advocating for the voluntary embrace of difficulty. He suggests that people should seek out challenges, discomfort, and adversity as a way of building strength. The book also contains a fascinating discussion of language and communication. Taleb argues that we should be precise with our words. He criticizes the tendency to use vague, abstract language that sounds impressive but means nothing. He gives the example of corporate jargon. Words like synergy, leverage, and optimization are used constantly in business, but they are empty of meaning. They are words without reference. Taleb says that real communication requires words that refer to concrete, observable things. He argues that this precision is not just a linguistic issue. It is a practical one. When you use vague language, you cannot think clearly. When you cannot think clearly, you make bad decisions. When you make bad decisions, you create fragility. Precision in language is the foundation of anti-fragile thinking. Let me now talk about the practical implications of anti-fragile for your daily life. Taleb does not just give you theory, he gives you actionable advice. First, he says you should expose yourself to small stresses regularly, take cold showers, fast occasionally, exercise intensely, read difficult books, engage in challenging conversations. These small stresses build your anti-fragile capacity. Second, he says you should avoid the middle ground in your investments and decisions. Be either very safe or very Risky. Do not trust moderate options that seem safe but are actually vulnerable. Third, he says you should build tripwires into your life, create simple rules that force you to take action when certain conditions are met. This prevents small problems from becoming catastrophes. Fourth, he says you should seek out uncertainty rather than avoid it. Embrace variability. Do not try to smooth out every rough edge in your life. The rough edges are where you grow. Taleb also has a chapter on the importance of redundancy. He argues that efficiency is the enemy of anti-fragility. When you optimize a system for maximum efficiency, you eliminate all slack and redundancy, but this makes the system fragile. A single disruption can bring the entire system down. Taleb advocates for maintaining some redundancy, keep extra cash on hand, have multiple sources of income, maintain backup systems. This might seem wasteful, but it is actually smart. The cost of redundancy is small compared to the cost of catastrophe. He gives the example of the Japanese railroad system. Trains run with extremely tight schedules, but they also have backup systems and contingency plans that allow them to recover quickly from disruptions. This is anti-fragile designed. IT accepts that disruptions will happen and prepares for them. One of the most powerful ideas in the book is the distinction between eumorph and aporia. Eumorph refers to systems that are designed to be perfect, elegant, and efficient. Aporia refers to systems that are messy, complex, and adaptive. Taleb argues that eumorph systems are fragile. They look beautiful on paper but collapse under real-world stress. Aporia systems are anti-fragile. They are ugly and inefficient, but they survive and thrive. He gives the example of the European Union, which he sees as an eumorph system. It was designed to be a perfect, integrated economic union, but it is fragile because it cannot adapt to local conditions. He contrasts this with the United States, which is more aporian. Individual states have different laws, different economies, different cultures. This creates redundancy and adaptability. When one state fails, others survive. The system as a whole is anti-fragile. Let me now discuss the role of trial and error in anti-fragile. Taleb argues that we learn through trial and error, not through contemplation and planning. The scientific method is the ultimate trial and error process. You hypothesize, you experiment, you observe, you revise. Each failed experiment teaches you something. Each successful experiment confirms your understanding. Taleb applies this to life. He says you should take small, frequent bets. Most will fail, but the failures teach you, and the successes pay off. He contrasts this with the approach of people who plan everything and then execute a single, carefully designed strategy. That strategy might work for a while, but when an unexpected event occurs, it fails completely because it was not designed to adapt. Taleb calls this the problem of the lone scientist. A scientist who works alone in a lab, running a single experiment, is fragile. A scientist who runs many experiments, learns from failures, and adapts is anti-fragile. The book also contains a critical discussion of the role of technology in modern life. Taleb is skeptical of technological solutions to problems. He argues that technology often creates new problems while solving old ones. He gives the example of the internet. The internet was supposed to connect people and spread information, but it has also created echo chambers, misinformation, and addiction. Taleb is not anti-technology. He is anti-naive technology. He argues that we should approach technology with caution and humility. We should test new technologies thoroughly before implementing them at scale. We should maintain the option to reject them if they cause more harm than good. This is the anti-fragile approach to technology. IT is not about rejecting innovation. IT is about being selective and adaptive. Let me now talk about the concept of the hedgehog and the fox, which Taleb borrows from the philosopher Isaiah Berlin. The hedgehog knows one big thing. The fox knows many small things. Taleb argues that hedgehogs are fragile. They have a single, grand theory that they apply to everything. When reality contradicts their theory, they deny reality rather than revise their theory. Foxes are anti-fragile. They have many small, practical insights that they apply situationally. When reality contradicts their knowledge, they adjust, they learn. Taleb gives the example of economists. Most economists are hedgehogs. They have a single model of the economy, and they apply it to every situation. When the model fails, they blame the data, not the model. Taleb himself is a fox. He has many small, practical insights about risk and uncertainty, and he applies them situationally. He is willing to change his mind when new evidence emerges. Another important chapter in the book is the one on the concept of the negative. Taleb argues that we should think about the absence of things, not just the presence of things. We often focus on what is there. We focus on assets, not liabilities. We focus on success, not failure. We focus on health, not the absence of disease. But Taleb says this is the wrong way to think. We should focus on what could go wrong, not just what could go right. We should think about the negative space, the things that are absent but could be present. This is a powerful mental model. IT helps you see risks that others missed. IT helps you build anti-fragile systems because you are not distracted by the positive. You are focused on the negative, which is where the real danger lies. Let me now discuss the relationship between anti-fragile and the concept of entropy. Entropy is a measure of disorder in a system. The second law of thermodynamics says that entropy always increases. Systems tend toward disorder, but Taleb argues that anti-fragile systems are the exception. They decrease their entropy by absorbing disorder from their environment. They use chaos as fuel. A muscle uses the chaos of exercise to build order in the form of stronger tissue. A business uses the chaos of competition to build order in the form of better products and services. A society uses the chaos of conflict to build order in the form of stronger institutions. This is the anti-fragile principle. Disorder is not the enemy. Disorder is the raw material from which order is built. Taleb also has a chapter on the importance of silence and solitude. He argues that modern society is too noisy. We are constantly bombarded with information, notifications, and distractions. This constant noise prevents us from thinking deeply. It makes us fragile because we lose the ability to be alone with our thoughts. Taleb advocates for regular periods of silence and solitude. He suggests that you should spend time every day without any input. No phone. No music. No conversation. Just silence. This is not just a relaxation technique. It is a way of building anti-fragility. When you are alone with your thoughts, you confront your own fears, desires, and limitations. You become stronger because you are not dependent on external stimulation. Let me now talk about the concept of the Lytic matrix, which Taleb uses to describe the difference between real-world uncertainty and the artificial uncertainty of games. In a game, the rules are known, the probabilities are known, the outcomes are bounded. In the real world, the rules are unknown, the probabilities are unknown, the outcomes are unbounded. Taleb argues that most people think the real world is like a game. They believe that they can calculate probabilities and manage risks using the same logic they use in games, but this is the Lytic fallacy. The real world is not a game. It is a messy, unpredictable, open-ended system. The only way to survive in such a system is to be anti-fragile. You need to build systems that can handle the unknown, not systems that assume the known. The book also contains a discussion of the role of time in decision-making. Taleb argues that most decisions are made with the wrong time horizon. People think too far ahead or too far behind. They plan for 10 years from now or they regret 10 years ago. But the only time that matters is now. Taleb advocates for a philosophy he calls the present moment. Focus on the present. Make decisions that are correct right now. Do not worry about the future because you cannot predict it. Do not dwell on the past because you cannot change it. This is not a call for short-term thinking. It is a call for present-mindedness. The present moment is the only point in time where you have any control. It is the only point where you can act. Let me now discuss the concept of the anti-frail, which is the opposite of anti-fragile. An anti-frail system is one that is actively harmed by stress, volatility, and uncertainty. It is worse off when things get harder. Taleb gives the example of a dependent person. Someone who relies entirely on others for their well-being is anti-frail. When things get harder, they suffer more. They do not adapt. They do not grow. They collapse. Taleb argues that we should identify anti-frail elements in our lives and eliminate them. This might mean ending a relationship that makes you weaker. It might mean leaving a job that makes you dependent. It might mean quitting a habit that makes you fragile. The goal is to remove anything that is anti-frail and replace it with something anti-fragile. One of the most memorable passages in the book is Taleb's discussion of the concept of the barbell strategy in the context of career development. He argues that most people choose careers that are in the middle of the risk spectrum. They get stable jobs with moderate pay and moderate growth, but these jobs are fragile. They seem safe, but they are vulnerable to unexpected disruptions. A single layoff can destroy your career. Taleb advocates for a barbell career strategy. On one end, you have a very stable job that provides a safety net. On the other end, you have a very risky venture that has huge upside potential. You avoid the middle. You do not build your entire career on a single, moderate risk path. You diversify your risk. You are anti-fragile because you have both safety and upside. Let me now talk about the role of randomness in anti-fragile. Taleb argues that randomness is not a bug in the system. It is a feature. Without randomness, there is no innovation, no creativity, no evolution. Life itself is a product of random mutations. The universe itself is full of random fluctuations. Taleb argues that we should not try to eliminate randomness. We should embrace it. We should seek out random experiences, random conversations, random opportunities. These random inputs are the fuel for anti-fragility. They introduce variety into your life, and variety is the antidote to fragility. A life without randomness is a life without growth. The book also contains a discussion of the concept of the pre-commitment, which is a way of binding yourself to a course of action in advance. Taleb argues that pre-commitment is a powerful tool for building anti-fragility. When you pre-commit to a decision, you remove the temptation to change your mind when things get difficult. You create a tripwire that forces you to stick to your plan. He gives the example of a person who wants to lose weight. They pre-commit by signing up for a gym membership and paying for it in advance. Now they have a financial incentive to go to the gym. They have bound themselves to a course of action. This is not about willpower. It is about design. You design your environment so that the right action is the easy action. Let me now discuss the concept of the negative rationality, which Taleb introduces in this book. Negative rationality is the idea that it is often better to avoid stupidity than to pursue intelligence. You do not need to be brilliant. You just need to not be foolish. Taleb gives the example of investing. The most important thing in investing is not to lose money. It is to avoid catastrophic losses. If you avoid the big mistakes, the small correct decisions will compound over time. This is a powerful shift in thinking. Most people try to be smart. They try to find the best investment, the best career move, the best relationship. Taleb says this is the wrong approach. You should try to avoid the stupid moves. You should eliminate the risks that could destroy you. Then you can let the small, correct decisions do their work over time. Another important concept is the idea of the skin in the game in the context of expertise. Taleb argues that true expertise requires skin in the game. A person who has never experienced failure, who has never lost money, who has never suffered, cannot be a true expert. They have not earned their knowledge. They have only read about it. Taleb gives the example of a financial advisor who has never managed their own money. They might have an MBA from a top school, but they have no practical experience. Their advice is fragile because it is based on theory, not practice. Taleb advocates for a system where expertise is earned through experience and consequences. You should only trust people who have skin in the game, who have suffered and learned from their mistakes. Let me now talk about the concept of the fragility of knowledge. Taleb argues that most knowledge is fragile. It is based on models and theories that are simplifications of reality. When reality changes, the models break. Taleb gives the example of economics. Economists have built elaborate models of the economy, but those models failed to predict the 2008 financial crisis. The models were fragile because they were based on assumptions that did not hold in the real world. Taleb advocates for a more humble approach to knowledge. He says we should acknowledge the limits of our knowledge. We should be skeptical of models that claim to predict the future. We should prefer knowledge that is tested by reality, not just by logic. The book also contains a discussion of the role of tradition in building anti-fragility. Taleb argues that traditions are anti-fragile because they have survived for centuries. They are the result of trial and error over generations. Each tradition that has survived contains wisdom that has been tested by time. Taleb gives the example of traditional diets. People have eaten certain foods for thousands of years. Those foods have survived because they are nutritious and safe. Modern diets, by contrast, are the result of corporate experimentation and marketing. They are fragile because they have not been tested by time. Taleb advocates for a return to traditional ways of eating, living, and thinking. He is not saying that everything old is good. He is saying that the old has been tested, and the new has not. Let me now discuss the concept of the fragility of progress. Taleb argues that the modern obsession with progress is itself a source of fragility. We believe that every problem can be solved, that every risk can be eliminated, that every uncertainty can be removed. But this belief is dangerous. It makes us complacent. It makes us ignore the risks that we cannot see. Taleb advocates for a more humble approach to progress. He says we should acknowledge that we do not know everything. We should be cautious about new technologies and new policies. We should test them thoroughly before implementing them at scale. This is not anti-progress. It is pro-caution. It is a recognition that progress can create new vulnerabilities even as it solves old ones. One of the most powerful metaphors in the book is Taleb's discussion of the concept of the turtle and the hedgehog. The turtle has a hard shell that protects it from predators, but the shell is also a burden. It makes the turtle slow and vulnerable to other threats. The hedgehog has quills that deter predators, but the quills are also a liability. They make the hedgehog difficult to handle and easy to injure. Taleb uses this metaphor to illustrate the trade-off between protection and flexibility. A system that is heavily protected is also heavily constrained. The system that is flexible is also vulnerable. The anti-fragile system is the one that finds the right balance. It is protected enough to survive, but flexible enough to adapt. Let me now talk about the concept of the fragility of certainty. Taleb argues that the desire for certainty is the root of fragility. When you demand certainty, you eliminate the possibility of adaptation. You create a system that is rigid and brittle. Taleb advocates for embracing uncertainty. He says that uncertainty is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition to be managed. You cannot eliminate uncertainty, but you can build systems that thrive in uncertainty. This is the essence of anti-fragility. It is not about controlling the future. It is about preparing for any future. The book also contains a discussion of the role of humor in building anti-fragility. Taleb argues that humor is a form of anti-fragility. It allows you to laugh at adversity, to find joy in suffering, to transform pain into something bearable. He gives the example of Jewish humor, which has a long tradition of finding comedy in tragedy. This is not about being flippant. It is about being resilient. Humor allows you to cope with difficulty without being crushed by it. Taleb advocates for cultivating a sense of humor, especially in the face of adversity. Let me now discuss the concept of the fragility of success. Taleb argues that success is often more dangerous than failure. When you are successful, you become overconfident. You start believing that you are invincible. You take risks that you would not have taken when you were struggling. Taleb gives the example of companies that become too successful and then collapse. They grew too big, too fast, too fragile. They lost the lessons of their early struggles. Taleb advocates for staying humble in success. He says that success should make you more cautious, not more confident. You should remember that success is often the result of luck, not skill. You should prepare for the possibility that success will end. Another important concept is the idea of the negative expertise. Taleb argues that it is more valuable to know what not to do than to know what to do. Most people focus on finding the right answer. Taleb says you should focus on avoiding the wrong answer. He gives the example of investing. The most important thing is not to pick the right stock. It is to avoid picking the wrong stock. If you avoid the losers, the winners will take care of themselves. This is a powerful mental model. It shifts your focus from optimization to elimination. You do not need to be brilliant, you just need to not be stupid. Let me now talk about the concept of the fragility of optimization. Taleb argues that optimization is the enemy of anti-fragility. When you optimize a system, you remove all slack and redundancy. You make it as efficient as possible, but this makes it fragile. A single disruption can bring the entire system down. Taleb advocates for maintaining some inefficiency. He says that inefficiency is not a waste. It is an investment in resilience. You should leave some slack in your system so that it can absorb shocks. This is the anti-fragile approach to optimization. It is not about maximizing efficiency. It is about maximizing survival. The book also contains a discussion of the role of pain in building antifragility. Taleb argues that pain is not something to be eliminated. It is something to be embraced. Pain is a signal that something is wrong. It is a teacher. It tells you what to avoid and what to change. Taleb gives the example of exercise. Exercise is painful. It causes micro tears in your muscles. But those micro tears heal stronger. The pain is the mechanism of growth. Taleb advocates for seeking out pain, not avoiding it. He says that a life without pain is a life without growth. Let me now discuss the concept of the fragility of comfort. Taleb argues that comfort is the enemy of antifragility. When you are comfortable, you stop growing, you stop adapting, you become fragile because you are no longer exposed to stressors. Taleb gives the example of animals in captivity. They are comfortable, but they are also weak. They cannot survive in the wild. Taleb advocates for regular exposure to discomfort. He says that discomfort is not something to be avoided. It is something to be sought. A life without discomfort is a life without strength. Another powerful idea in the book is the concept of the barbell in relationships. Taleb argues that most relationships are in the middle of the risk spectrum. They are comfortable but not deeply meaningful. Taleb advocates for a barbell approach to relationships. On one end, you have a few very close, deeply committed relationships. On the other end, you have many casual, low-stakes relationships. You avoid the middle. You do not invest heavily in relationships that are neither deeply committed nor completely casual. This is a barbell strategy for relationships. It maximizes both depth and breadth while avoiding the fragility of the middle ground. Let me now talk about the concept of the fragility of expertise. Taleb argues that expertise is often fragile because it is based on narrow knowledge. An expert in one field may be helpless in another. Taleb advocates for broad, interdisciplinary knowledge. He says that you should learn from multiple fields, not just your own. This makes you anti-fragile because you can adapt to new situations. An expert who only knows one field is fragile because they cannot handle situations outside their expertise. The book also contains a discussion of the role of failure in building anti-fragility. Taleb argues that failure is not something to be avoided. It is something to be embraced. Failure is the primary mechanism of learning. Taleb gives the example of scientific research. Most experiments fail, but those failures teach scientists what does not work. They refine the hypothesis. They get closer to the truth. Taleb advocates for seeking out failure, not avoiding it. He says that a life without failure is a life without learning. Let me now discuss the concept of the fragility of planning. Taleb argues that detailed planning is a form of fragility. When you plan everything, you are vulnerable to unexpected events. Taleb advocates for flexible planning. He says you should have a general direction, but you should be willing to change course when new information arrives. This is the anti-fragile approach to planning. It is not about predicting the future. It is about adapting to the future. Another important concept is the idea of the negative space in decision-making. Taleb argues that you should focus on what you are not doing, not just what you are doing. The negative space is the set of opportunities you are passing up. Taleb advocates for being aware of the negative space. He says that the most important decisions are often the ones you do not make. This is a powerful mental model. It shifts your focus from action to inaction. You do not need to do more. You need to avoid doing the wrong things. Let me now talk about the concept of the fragility of growth. Taleb argues that rapid growth is often a sign of fragility. When something grows too fast, it becomes unstable. Taleb gives the example of startups. Many startups grow rapidly, but they are fragile because they have not had time to build strong foundations. Taleb advocates for slow, sustainable growth. He says that growth should be gradual, not explosive. This is the anti-fragile approach to growth. It is not about growing fast. It is about growing strong. The book also contains a discussion of the role of memory in building anti-fragility. Taleb argues that memory is a form of anti-fragility. It allows you to learn from past mistakes. Taleb gives the example of oral traditions. Cultures that have strong oral traditions are more anti-fragile because they can transmit knowledge across generations. Taleb advocates for preserving memory, both personal and collective. He says that a society without memory is a society without wisdom. Let me now discuss the concept of the fragility of knowledge transfer. Taleb argues that knowledge is often lost when it is not practiced. He gives the example of traditional crafts. When a craft is no longer practiced, the knowledge is lost. Taleb advocates for practicing what you know. He says that knowledge is not just information. It is action. You only truly know something when you can do it. This is the anti-fragile approach to knowledge. It is not about storing information. It is about using it. Another powerful idea in the book is the concept of the barbell in learning. Taleb argues that most learning is in the middle of the depth spectrum. People learn a little about many things, but they do not master anything. Taleb advocates for a barbell approach to learning. On one end, you have deep mastery of a few things. On the other end, you have broad exposure to many things. You avoid the middle. You do not spread yourself too thin. This is the anti-fragile approach to learning. It is not about learning everything. It is about learning deeply and broadly. Let me now talk about the concept of the fragility of communication. Taleb argues that modern communication is fragile because it is based on speed, not accuracy. Social media rewards quick, emotional responses over careful, reasoned analysis. Taleb advocates for slower, more deliberate communication. He says that you should think before you speak. You should verify before you share. This is the anti-fragile approach to communication. It is not about being fast. It is about being right. The book also contains a discussion of the role of solitude in building anti-fragility. Taleb argues that solitude is essential for developing independent thinking. He gives the example of great thinkers throughout history. Many of them spent long periods in solitude. Taleb advocates for regular periods of solitude. He says that you should spend time alone, without distractions, to think clearly. This is the anti-fragile approach to solitude. It is not about isolation. It is about reflection. Let me now discuss the concept of the fragility of certainty in relationships. Taleb argues that relationships based on certainty are fragile. When you are certain about someone, you stop growing together. Taleb advocates for relationships that embrace uncertainty. He says that you should always be learning about your partner, always being surprised by them. This is the anti-fragile approach to relationships. It is not about knowing everything. It is about staying curious. Another important concept is the idea of the negative in health. Taleb argues that most health advice focuses on what you should add to your life, not what you should remove. Taleb advocates for removing harmful things. He says that the most important thing in health is not to add supplements, but to remove toxins. This is the anti-fragile approach to health. It is not about adding. It is about subtracting. Let me now talk about the concept of the fragility of happiness. Taleb argues that the pursuit of happiness is often counterproductive. When you chase happiness, you become unhappy because you are never satisfied. Taleb advocates for pursuing meaning instead of happiness. He says that meaning comes from struggle, not from comfort. This is the anti-fragile approach to happiness. It is not about feeling good. It is about being good. The book also contains a discussion of the role of death in building anti-fragility. Taleb argues that contemplating death is essential for living well. He gives the example of the Stoic practice of memento mori. Remember that you will die. This awareness makes you appreciate life. Taleb advocates for regular contemplation of mortality. He says that a life without death is a life without urgency. Let me now discuss the concept of the fragility of progress in technology. Taleb argues that technological progress is often faster than our ability to understand its consequences. He gives the example of social media. It was introduced with great optimism, but we are only now seeing its negative effects. Taleb advocates for slower technological adoption. He says that we should test new technologies thoroughly before implementing them at scale. This is the anti-fragile approach to technology. It is not about rejecting innovation. It is about being cautious. Another powerful idea in the book is the concept of the barbell in risk management. Taleb argues that most risk management is in the middle of the spectrum. People try to manage all risks equally, which is impossible. Taleb advocates for a barbell approach to risk. On one end, you eliminate catastrophic risks. On the other end, you accept small risks. You avoid the middle. You do not try to manage every risk. This is the anti-fragile approach to risk. It is not about controlling everything. It is about surviving the uncontrollable. Let me now talk about the concept of the fragility of certainty in economics. Taleb argues that economic models are fragile because they assume rational actors and efficient markets. Taleb advocates for models that account for human irrationality and market inefficiency. He says that economics should be based on reality, not on assumptions. This is the anti-fragile approach to economics. It is not about perfect models. It is about useful models. The book also contains a discussion of the role of culture in building anti-fragility. Taleb argues that cultures that embrace diversity are more anti-fragile. He gives the example of multicultural societies. They are more adaptable because they have a wider range of perspectives. Taleb advocates for cultural diversity. He says that a monoculture is a fragile culture. This is the anti-fragile approach to culture. It is not about uniformity. It is about variety. Let me now discuss the concept of the fragility of certainty in politics. Taleb argues that political systems based on certainty are fragile. When politicians promise certainty, they create false expectations. Taleb advocates for political humility. He says that politicians should acknowledge uncertainty and focus on building resilient institutions. This is the anti-fragile approach to politics. It is not about promising solutions. It is about building capacity. Another important concept is the idea of the negative in education. Taleb argues that most education focuses on what to teach, not on what not to teach. Taleb advocates for teaching students how to think, not what to think. He says that education should be about developing critical thinking, not about memorizing facts. This is the anti-fragile approach to education. It is not about filling minds. It is about sharpening them. Let me now talk about the concept of the fragility of certainty in science. Taleb argues that science is often presented as certain, but it is actually provisional. Every scientific discovery is subject to revision. Taleb advocates for scientific humility. He says that scientists should acknowledge uncertainty and be willing to change their minds. This is the anti-fragile approach to science. It is not about finding final truths. It is about pursuing better approximations. The book also contains a discussion of the role of art in building anti-fragility. Taleb argues that art is anti-fragile because it embraces chaos and ambiguity. He gives the example of jazz music. Jazz is improvised. It is unpredictable. It thrives on uncertainty. Taleb advocates for embracing art that is challenging and ambiguous. He says that art should not be comfortable. It should be stimulating. This is the anti-fragile approach to art. It is not about entertainment. It is about transformation. Let me now discuss the concept of the fragility of certainty in spirituality. Taleb argues that spirituality based on certainty is fragile. When you claim to know the mind of God, you become dogmatic. Taleb advocates for spiritual humility. He says that spirituality should be about questioning, not about answering. This is the anti-fragile approach to spirituality. It is not about certainty, it is about wonder. Another powerful idea in the book is the concept of the barbell in happiness. Taleb argues that most people pursue happiness in the middle of the spectrum. They seek moderate comfort and moderate pleasure. Taleb advocates for a barbell approach to happiness. On one end, you practice deep gratitude for what you have. On the other end, you seek intense experiences that challenge you. You avoid the middle. You do not settle for mediocre happiness. This is the anti-fragile approach to happiness. It is not about comfort, it is about meaning. Let me now talk about the concept of the fragility of certainty in leadership. Taleb argues that leaders who claim certainty are fragile. When they face uncertainty, they panic. Taleb advocates for humble leadership. He says that leaders should acknowledge what they do not know and build teams that can adapt. This is the anti-fragile approach to leadership. It is not about having all the answers, it is about asking the right questions. The book also contains a discussion of the role of failure in business. Taleb argues that businesses that avoid failure are fragile. They do not learn, they do not adapt. Taleb advocates for embracing failure in business. He says that failure is the tuition you pay for success. This is the anti-fragile approach to business. It is not about avoiding mistakes, it is about learning from them. Let me now discuss the concept of the fragility of certainty in parenting. Taleb argues that parents who try to protect their children from all failure are creating fragile adults. Taleb advocates for allowing children to take risks and make mistakes. He says that failure is essential for building resilience. This is the anti-fragile approach to parenting. It is not about shielding children, it is about preparing them. Another important concept is the idea of the negative in creativity. Taleb argues that creativity is often blocked by too much input. We consume too much information, too much entertainment, too much noise. Taleb advocates for creative silence. He says that you should spend time without input to allow your mind to generate original ideas. This is the anti-fragile approach to creativity. It is not about consuming, it is about creating. Let me now talk about the concept of the fragility of certainty in aging. Taleb argues that aging is often viewed as decline, but it can also be viewed as anti-fragility. Older people have accumulated wisdom through experience. They have survived many storms. Taleb advocates for respecting the wisdom of age. He says that aging is not something to be feared, it is something to be embraced. This is the anti-fragile approach to aging. It is not about fighting time, it is about growing with it. The book also contains a discussion of the role of death in philosophy. Taleb argues that philosophy that ignores death is incomplete. He gives the example of existentialism. Existentialist philosophers focused on death and meaning. Taleb advocates for philosophical engagement with mortality. He says that philosophy should help us live better by confronting death. This is the anti-fragile approach to philosophy. It is not about abstract speculation, it is about practical wisdom. Let me now discuss the concept of the fragility of certainty in mathematics. Taleb argues that mathematics is often presented as certain, but it is based on axioms that are themselves unprovable. Taleb advocates for mathematical humility. He says that mathematics is a tool, not a truth. This is the anti-fragile approach to mathematics. It is not about finding absolute certainty, it is about building useful models. Another powerful idea in the book is the concept of the barbell in knowledge. Taleb argues that most knowledge is in the middle of the spectrum. People know a little about many things, but they do not deeply understand anything. Taleb advocates for a barbell approach to knowledge. On one end, you have deep expertise in a few areas. On the other end, you have broad curiosity about many areas. You avoid the middle. This is the anti-fragile approach to knowledge. It is not about knowing everything. It is about knowing deeply and broadly. Let me now talk about the concept of the fragility of certainty in language. Taleb argues that language is often used to obscure rather than clarify. Jargon, euphemisms, and political correctness make communication fragile. Taleb advocates for plain language. He says that you should speak clearly and directly. This is the anti-fragile approach to language. It is not about sounding smart, it is about being understood. The book also contains a discussion of the role of boredom in building anti-fragility. Taleb argues that boredom is essential for creativity and reflection. We have eliminated boredom from our lives with smartphones and constant entertainment. Taleb advocates for embracing boredom. He says that boredom is not something to be avoided, it is something to be cultivated. This is the anti-fragile approach to boredom. It is not about being entertained, it is about being present. Let me now discuss the concept of the fragility of certainty in travel. Taleb argues that travel that is too planned and too comfortable is fragile. You do not grow from a vacation that is perfectly organized. Taleb advocates for adventurous travel. He says that you should get lost, meet strangers, and embrace the unexpected. This is the anti-fragile approach to travel. It is not about checking boxes, it is about having experiences. Another important concept is the idea of the negative in diet. Taleb argues that most diet advice focuses on what to eat, not on what not to eat. Taleb advocates for removing harmful foods rather than adding supplements. He says that the most important thing in diet is elimination, not addition. This is the anti-fragile approach to diet. It is not about counting calories, it is about removing toxins. Let me now talk about the concept of the fragility of certainty in sleep. Taleb argues that modern sleep habits are fragile. We sleep too little, too irregularly, and in environments that are not natural. Taleb advocates for returning to natural sleep.